Heard today the words from Hosea, which brings hope to a congregation that's been through, use the expression, hell for the last couple of years. And we thank God for bringing us through and offering that hope that all of that's behind us now and that a new time is coming. So let's open our Bibles. We have the privilege on the second Sunday. You may be seated. I'm sorry. I don't want you standing for the whole sermon here. It's going to be about an hour and a half, but so don't leave yet. All righty, we're at the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark, the first chapter, beginning in the first verse. And we're going to be in this Gospel for this coming liturgical year, for the whole year, except during Lent. We'll be doing excerpts from St. John's Gospel, particularly chapter 6, the chapter about the bread of life and our sacrament of Holy Eucharist. So it's going to be a great year for listening to Jesus teach us and lead us, and through his word sanctify us, to make us holy, to make us like him in every way. Well, just a little background here. As we begin this gospel, I just want to focus your attention on the very first verse of chapter 1 of Mark. Because like most writers today, any fiction writer, any nonfiction writer, when the very first words that they utter in a book that they write really send a message about what the proposition or the thesis of that whole book's going to be. You know, the very first words tell us what the point of the whole thing is. So Mark, in this very first verse, tells us what the point of his gospel is going to be, from chapter 1 to chapter 16. So as we're reading this gospel this year, I hope we'll pay attention to what Mark said in this first verse. It's absolutely revolutionary. Now, who was Mark? Let's start with that. Okay, Mark was the son of a wealthy woman who was a supporter and follower of Jesus, who lived in Jerusalem. And if you remember from the book of Acts, in chapter 12, when the angel led Peter out of prison, he went to her house first. So Mark grew up not as a disciple of Jesus, but as a child, a growing young man, learning about Jesus through his parents and through the other apostles, and particularly through Peter, because Peter came to that house, first house he went to as soon as he was released. So this is very important. Somehow, when we read in the book of Acts also, Mark became a disciple of St. Paul through his uncle, St. Barnabas. It's all a family thing here, okay? It's amazing. So he became a disciple of St. Barnabas, his uncle, who rescued Paul from the Jerusalem doubters and naysayers. And they went on a missionary journey, on the first missionary journey. And you remember Mark went along with them. But for some reason, and nobody really knows the reason, there's a lot of speculation that he got homesick for Mama, that he got ticked because Paul was taking over his uncle Barnabas. All kinds of speculation. It's all, you can make anything you want. It doesn't make any difference. So Mark aborts his time with Paul and Barnabas on that missionary journey and goes back home to Jerusalem. Somewhere along, and we don't know when, Mark went back to being a friend of St. Peter, the apostle, where Peter came to his house after he got out of prison. The angel led him out of prison. And he became a follower of Peter. Peter, we know, ended up in the city of Rome. And it was there that Mark went from Palestine. He was a Jew who went from Palestine to Rome to be with Peter, and he began to record the sermons that Peter would give, the catechism that Peter would do with the church in Rome, with the believers and the non-believers, with Jews and Gentiles. Now, when we read Mark's gospel, his Greek is terrible. So it shows us that wasn't his first language. My Greek is not that good either. So he goes there, and so he writes this gospel in Greek. Now, it's not like the fancy, beautiful, classical Greek that we read in St. Luke. St. Luke was a Gentile. He grew up speaking Greek. He learned to be a doctor in Greek. So he really knew the language, and he was a great writer. Mark, on the other hand, really didn't know the language. So what I thought we'd do today is see what Mark is saying about his gospel in that very first sentence. And I hope, and my prayer for me in Advent, this second week of Advent, and I hope it'll be your prayer too, to get us to catch on fire with this message that's going to come to us through Mark all this year. It's an absolutely, we read it from eyes 2,000 years later, but it's a message that is totally revolutionary if we look at this first sentence. And in this first sentence is contained the truth of why Christians were hated and were martyred so much by the emperors. Okay? Let's get into this gospel here. Okay? Chapter 1, verse 1. Now, I want us to imagine we're in the first century here. Use your holy imagination. We're first century Christians. We're sitting down. Peter is talking. And we're listening to St. Peter talk to us about his friend who he knows to be God, Jesus. And so Peter is giving, he says, the beginning, Mark writes, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. So let's unpack that verse. First of all, the beginning. Now, if you're a Jew in first century Rome, when you heard the word in the beginning, what would you think of? You would think of creation. You would think of the very first word in the Bible, in Genesis, in the beginning. So what that is saying about Mark's gospel, I'm going to give you a story about a new creation. So he goes back to that, and Peter writes in that, we heard that lesson today that Steve read, but not Steve, you didn't read it, Dr. Bill read. You read very, very well, Dr. Bill. And he talked about getting ready for the beginning, the new creation. That's what we're in this season to do, to get ready to see God in a new way, to see the universe in a new way. We know that in the first creation, God did not start with any working materials. He didn't have a shop that he could go to. There was no Lowe's or a Home Depot that he could go right to and say, hey, give me 6 tons of dirt. I'm going to make a planet. He started with nothing. It was God himself, zero, zip, nada, who with nothing said, let there be. By his spoken word, this whole universe, which we haven't even come to grips to a small part of it, came to be. Can you imagine? So in this beginning, God said, the first thing he did was say, let there be light. When there was chaos over the world. And so God, in the beginning of creation, overcame the chaos that was in what was he had already established by bringing light into it, by bringing order into the creation. And so when Mark starts his gospel, he says, God's going to bring a new order, and here it is. God is bringing a new order. So, in our first century mode here, we say, Peter is saying to us, or Mark is saying, this is the beginning of something absolutely new, a new creation. You know, Paul speaks of that. We are a new creation, a new creature. The old is past. It's gone. Sometimes I don't feel that, but nevertheless, it's gone. And the new has come. So this gospel is about God doing something new that's bigger and better than Genesis 1. Keep that in mind, okay? The beginning of what? The good news, the gospel in some translations. The beginning of the good news, the gospel. The word is evangelion in Greek, huh? EU means good, angelon means angel or messenger. The good message, the good news. Now, what's the good news? Well, when we look behind that word as it was used again by our people who are not in here with us, who are non-Christians, who are just Roman citizens of anywhere in the empire, whenever a general of the Roman Empire or the emperor himself accomplished some great thing, the government would issue an evangelion, a good news. It would be like an extra on an old, if you remember newspapers. They don't exist much anymore. But anyway, if you remember, it would be like, this is good news. This is what the emperor or this general has accomplished. It's about a victory. So what Mark is telling us, he's going to present some good news, some gospel, some glad tidings about a great victory that someone has won. Not the emperor, not some Roman general. But then he names the person. The good news about Jesus, the Messiah. Now remember, Mark was a Jew writing, he would write Jesus Christos in Greek. But what he had in his mind as a young Jew was Yeshua Messiah. That's what his words are in Greek. Jesus, the Messiah. Jesus, the Anointed One. Jesus, the Christ in our English. So he says, I'm going to bring you an extra, read all about it, news about this man, Jesus. Now, when you hear the word Yeshua, here as Jews in first century Rome, well, who would you think of? Well, you'd probably think of Joshua in the Old Testament. Yeshua is the Greek for is the Hebrew for Joshua, and you remember that Joshua took over after Moses died. He took over his prophetic ministry. I think we think about that in our opening hymn here. He took over the prophetic ministry, but he also took over the military thing. And what did Joshua do that Moses didn't do? He led the people out of the wilderness into the promised land. He was the one who saved people. He was the savior of people. Yeshua means God saves. He was God's agent to save the people from wandering around in confusion and chaos through the wilderness of their lives into the promised land where they had hope and where they could live. And he says this good news, this extra I have, read all about it, about this, not this emperor, not Tiberius or Nero, who were the emperors there, but this news is about Yeshua, this Jesus, the Messiah. Now, the Messiah is God's anointed. Who was the anointed one in the Old Testament that we as Jews would think of? Well, it would be David, wouldn't it? He was the Messiah. Samuel, after he called him to be the king of Israel, called David to be the king of Israel, he anointed him, and the book of Samuel tells us the Spirit rushed upon him mightily at that time. So he became the anointed one. He became the greatest king of Israel. He had more territory. He defeated Philistines. Every enemy that Israel had went down under his sword. And this is Jesus now. This is the one who, not by sword, but by being killed by the Romans on the cross. Seemed like he was defeated, but what the Romans did, God undone. God undone on the third day by raising this Jesus from the dead. So he became not a Yeshua in the Old Testament sense, but a forever Messiah in the New Testament sense. He's here forever. He's forever the Messiah. And then he adds that phrase, the Son of God. This is where the revolution of this amazing gospel comes. That this is why Rome killed all the evangelists, essentially, except John. They tried to kill him, but they couldn't. This is why Christians were put to death. Because they claimed that this Jesus was the Son of God. And you know what that was in our day, in the first century? It was a title given to the Roman emperor. It goes back to Julius Caesar in 44 BC when he was killed. He made his adopted son, Octavius, the new Caesar. And so when he became Caesar, he put on Caesar after he was killed became divine. He became a god to the Romans. And so Augustus Caesar, Octavius, when he became Caesar, took on the name Augustus, and he became the Son of God. The Son of the God. That's what it says in Greek. The Son of the God. And so that was a title for the Roman emperor. Now here we are, this little group of Christians. We have no support in society. Nobody likes us. Even our brothers and sisters in our own Jewish religion, our own faith, can't stand us because we're followers of the way. And so, listen, Mark is saying that, listen, Tiberius is not the emperor. Jesus is. So that's a message that goes down through all the ages. Back in communist Russia, their Bibles had to be, like in China today, Bibles have to be smuggled into the country, North Korea, China, Russia, because it says there is somebody more powerful than whoever is the king or president in this place. And that's someone according to St. Mark. In just this first sentence, he said, guys, we have a new emperor. And you know, when you think about this, when Mark wrote his gospel before the year 70 or so. Now, 4 years before that, in 66 AD, the guy whose teachings he was recording was crucified. Peter was crucified in Rome. Paul was beheaded about the same time. So the two great apostles of the Christian faith, Peter and Paul, were crucified just 4 years before he wrote this gospel. And he's trying to encourage the people to not look down and think that everything's lost or defeated. Jesus was killed, he rose, but Peter and Paul did not rise. They're dead. No, now what do we do? But he said, what he's saying in his first sentence, and it's really important for us today, don't worry. We have a new emperor, and he's more powerful and mightier than Tiberius, than Nero. Nero was the one who had Peter and Paul killed, by the way. Murdered, martyred. Because he blamed them for the fire in Rome, which he himself started. But he blamed the Christians. And so, ever since, can you imagine, here we are living in the first century. We're not even sure we can get through this service without being met at the door by Roman soldiers and put to death. Aren't you glad you came? There's no Roman soldiers out there. But the message is still true. Jesus is Lord of lords. He's King of kings. And he's a living Lord and is a living King, and he's here with us today. And he's more powerful than ever any political leader, any social leader, any entertainer, anybody. He is more powerful than any person that has ever lived and ever will live. And we're here to worship him. Saints, that's good news. So in that one verse, the rest of Mark's gospel unfolds. It doesn't stop at the crucifixion. It stops at the resurrection. And then it picks up. So it's a gospel that we're still in. We're still in that new creation. That's where we're living now. And that's what Peter tells us to live ourselves into, spotless, blameless before the Lord. So when he comes to finish this new creation, you and I will be ready for him. Amen. So that's our little history lesson today. Mark's a great gospel. It's very short. It reads like when you read it, he doesn't waste any time with beauty talk. You know, he doesn't have all flourishing. He just begins every chapter with the word "and," and then Jesus did this, and then Jesus said that, and Jesus got. If you look at Mark's gospel, most of his gospel has nothing, not much of his teaching. It has is to fight with the enemy, Satan. It has to do with deliverance ministry. It has to do, 1/3 of Mark's whole gospel is the passion and death and resurrection of Jesus. Begins, chapter 11 already begins the crucifixion, the passion of Jesus. Imagine it. It's all about this Messiah, the beginning. And it's a gospel that still has an end. It's a good news that's here for us today. And I hope we all take it home and live with that story that Peter told and Mark recorded. That this is a new creation. We are living in a new creation. And we have a message about a greater victory than any other victory of any political power has ever had. It's the victory over life, sin, and death. Amen.